Welcome back to Post Whatever with Ken Nishikawa. Today is the 6th of August, which means it's time to touch the third rail of modern history, Hiroshima. Now, before anyone reaches for the red button that says unsubscribe in a fit of patriotic or moral outrage, well, not that I've got that many subscribers to lose, but give me 20 minutes or so. I promise to annoy absolutely everyone equally. This show is always programmed to be dropped at 8 p.m. JST sharp every week. And that means exactly 81 years and 11 hours 45 minutes ago, to be ridiculously precise, or 8:15 a.m. on the 6th of August 1945, the atomic bomb detonated over a city full of human beings for the first time in human history, and it would not be the last. The debate over whether this was a legitimate strategic necessity or war crime dressed up in the language of military inevitability has never really ended. I shall try all in my might to lay out the context, the event, and the aftermath and possible alternative outcome as honestly as I can, and offer my own analysis, including whether there were better options on the table. Now, when it comes to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, people in Japan understandably get extremely emotional. I happen to think that if you actually want to see something as they really are, you have to give your burning emotions a little holiday because they tend to fog up the windscreen. Emotions are there for the reasons, and you can use them for art. We cannot live without emotions, but in this case, let your deduction dance and your reason sing. Disclaimer: I'm not an expert on this subject. In fairness, I'm not really an expert on anything. It's more of a personal brand at this point, a very, very small, negligible personal brand. But I'd like to think I am equipped with just enough intellectual furniture to offer an informed view and maybe an alternative one on this exceptionally grave subject. The official narrative, the one I was taught in a Japanese classroom, more or less between naps, is that the bombs were dropped to end the war as quickly as possible. Cruel in the extreme, but necessary. In the West, for the Allies, the chief justification was saving the lives of hundreds of thousands of American troops. Because had the war continued, the Allies would have needed to launch an amphibious invasion of mainland Japan, one planned to dwarf D-Day itself. There were two phases. Phase 1, Operation Olympic. Target Kyushu, specifically Miyazaki and Kagoshima, so in the south. The target date, rather ominously with Elon's favourite letter, X-Day, was the 1st of November 1945. Phase 2, Operation Coronet. Target the Kanto Plain, so Tokyo essentially, with amphibious landing planned for the beaches of Chiba and Kanagawa. Kujukuri and Shonan, today's surfing paradise, as the site of a full-scale invasion. For context, this combined operation was intended to eclipse Operation Overlord, the Normandy landing, as the largest amphibious assault in human history. Projected Allied casualties for the invasion of Japan ranged, depending on which planner's estimate you believe, somewhere between 250,000 and 1 million personnel. Japanese casualties, military and civilian combined, were far greater, projected to run into the millions. There are a contested worst-case scenario that estimates the figure to be tens of millions. Well, with kamikaze attacks and everything, we all know how far the Japanese are willing to go during that time, but even the low end is horrifying. On the other hand, the death toll from Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined, including death from radiation sickness in the years that followed, is generally estimated at somewhere between roughly 210,000 and over 300,000. However you land on the exact figure, it is, on paper at least, well below the millions projected had the war continued by conventional means. So, does that mean dropping the bomb was, in cold arithmetic terms, the more humane political and strategic decision? Not quite. Not 100% in my opinion. Following the fall of Nazi Germany in May 1945, former Japanese Prime Minister Koki Hirota held a series of secret meetings with the Soviet ambassador to explore whether Moscow might act as a neutral broker for peace between Japan and the United States. Also, in April 1945, the Japanese military attaché in Stockholm, General Makoto Onodera, used Swedish intermediaries to try to open a back channel to Washington and London. Similar informal feelers were extended through Bern, Switzerland. This is the episode historians usually refer to as the Dulles-Fujimura contacts. Now, was the US intelligence aware of all this? Yes, completely. Of course they did. American codebreakers were reading Japanese diplomatic cable traffic throughout this period, the intercept program known as MAGIC or MAGIC. And I think the Swedes would have informed the British and the Americans of this secret move. So this wasn't a case of Washington being kept in the dark. All the top politicians knew. So the question is then, knowing the Japanese government was making overtures through Sweden and the Soviet Union, and Switzerland to find a path to peace as early as the spring of 1945. Can the hasting the end of the war justification really be taken entirely at face value? And before I go any further, there are a few other less flattering theories attached to the decision. That so much money had been sunk into the Manhattan Project that Washington felt obliged to use it before the war ended and see the result. The way one might feel compelled to eat an extravagantly expensive meal one didn't much enjoy simply because of what it costs. Or that, with the Cold War already forming on the horizon, it was a demonstration of biblical firepower for Stalin's benefit. But clearly, these theories aren't exactly built on the foundation of ethics or Christian values, and they're not something the American government has ever been inclined or will ever likely to officially admit or confirm. So, for the sake of the argument, let's set them aside. If the US government already knew Tokyo was reaching out to Stockholm and Moscow to broker an end to the war as early as spring 1945, surely the bomb can't be justified. Well, here's the complication. The Japanese cabinet itself was deeply divided. Some sought a negotiated peace, others were determined to fight to the last man, woman, and bamboo spear, which we'll come back to later on. That division persisted well after Nagasaki. What really irks me about this is that the latter, more gung-ho faction's objective seemed to be all about protecting the emperor and preserving the imperial household, while subjects are more or less regarded as dispensable. Another classic example of toxic patriotism. In fact, it's beyond toxic patriotism. It was a toxic cult, and the core member of our current government are rather keen to revive it. Great. Plus, Japan, in any negotiation, would have been asking for terms it had essentially no leverage to demand. So Washington's skepticism about whether Tokyo was seriously prepared to negotiate, given the position it was actually in, is, I think, perhaps not unreasonable. Now, let's have a bit of fun. Let's play out the alternative, the parallel universe. Suppose FDR had lived, or Harry S. Truman had been replaced by a more, shall we say, cautious, even benevolent successor. Someone deeply uneasy about the historical weight of being the man who unleashed an apocalyptic weapon on an enemy that was, by any measure, already on its knees, and also consisted of mostly civilians. His name might go down in infamy, because after all, even Nazi Germany managed to refrain from using chemical or biological weapons on the battlefield right up to the bitter end. So, a hypothetical, cautious president chooses the less politically radioactive option and sticks to conventional warfare. The outcome? Up to 1 million Allied casualties and several million, possibly more than 10 million Japanese casualties. And that's not even the worst part in this parallel universe. In our universe, in which we all live, on the 9th of August, the Soviet Union broke the Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact and launched a surprise invasion of Japanese-held Manchuria and Sakhalin Island. By the 15th of August, the Red Army was poised to invade Hokkaido. Had the war dragged on into 1946, it is entirely plausible that the Soviets would have pushed further towards Hokkaido. Truman actually refused Stalin's request for permission to invade the island, but I suspect Stalin would have gone ahead regardless. After all, the Soviets had paid bigger price than anyone to help defeat the Axis. So why should he take orders from the American presidents? And with the war being fought entirely with conventional weapons in this parallel universe, Truman or some hypothetical, cautious, benevolent US president's refusal might not have carried the same weight it did in this universe. So, the victorious Red Army pressed on beyond Hokkaido, down through Honshu, to the north of Tokyo, Ibaraki, Gunma. You can probably guess where this goes. Yes, the birth of a new nation. The People's Republic of Democratic Japan, also known as North Japan, under a Soviet-backed communist government, the same fate that befell the Korean Peninsula and post-war Germany. I think this is a genuine plausible scenario. Somewhere north of Tokyo in this parallel world, an enormous fortified border, minefields and all. The capital of the People's Republic of Democratic Japan, Sapporo, Sendai, or possibly Niigata. And worst of all, affluent Aussie would have had to find somewhere else to indulge their summertime skiing habit. So, do I think this dystopian outcome was narrowly averted by the bomb? Well, yes and no. Yes, insofar as the Japanese military council did indeed keep insisting on continuing the war even after Hiroshima. But how exactly were they proposing to do that? By August 1945, Japan had essentially run out of everything needed to sustain the war effort. Fuel, raw materials, food. Adding to this, and this is often overlooked, 2 major earthquakes struck Japan in December 1944 and January 1945, the Tonankai and Mikawa earthquakes respectively. The first one was followed by a tsunami, both centered on Aichi Prefecture, home to Nagoya's industrial base and significant chunk of the country's aircraft manufacturing, and where Toyota's headquarters are today. Thousands perished, and a great deal of war-related industrial capacity was damaged. In other words, even without the help of American carpet bombing, Japan's industrial output was already severely impeded by this point. To make matters worse, the 1945 rice harvest was one of the poorest in modern Japanese history, and officials at the time feared a famine that could have killed on the order of 1 million people. This was averted, and this, I think, is genuinely something Japan owes the Americans a debt of gratitude for. They fed us properly after the war. As for the once mighty Imperial Japanese Navy, by August 1945, it had precisely 1 barely operational battleship, Nagato, and 3 small aircraft carriers, all of them either immobilized or non-functional. What aircraft remained were largely grounded for lack of fuel. So, women and children were issued bamboo spears and told to fight a fully mechanized American infantry under the slogan, Hitori Issatsu, 1 person, 1 kill. Try to take at least 1 enemy soldier with you before you're killed. So, the atomic bombs may well have saved millions of lives as a result. But it was still, in some sense, a case of kicking a man who was already flat on the ground. I suppose Washington wasn't in the mood to take any chances. Now, the following part is entirely my own opinion. Imagine winning the war in 1946 or 45 by conventional means, at the cost of 1 million young American lives, only for the public to later learn the military had successfully tested a war-ending superweapon back in July 1945, and chose not to use it on the moral ground or whatever. The political backlash would have been unimaginable. Therefore, I honestly don't think Truman genuinely had the option of not using it. Okay, so he had to use that dreadful bomb. But with the benefit of hindsight, Hiroshima was not a wise choice. Well, in my humble opinion. If the sole goal was to end the war as fast as possible and save American servicemen's lives, as the official narrative insists, as opposed to an experiment on living human and see what happens, then the most rational and arguably the most ethical option would have been to detonate it somewhere like Tokyo Bay. A demonstration right under the nose of the Japanese government and military council of exactly what they were up against. Sure, that would still have been an environmental catastrophe, and there would certainly have been casualties from radiation exposure, but on a scale genuinely negligible compared to Hiroshima or Nagasaki. Which brings me to the second bomb. Dropping it on Nagasaki within 3 days, on the 9th of August 1945. The Japanese governing style has never exactly been known for snap decisions. Japanese people in general are not insistent. And given the leadership a mere 72 hours to decide whether to end 2,600 years of imperial tradition and possibly send a man regarded as a living god, well, equivalent to Pope, to the gallows is utterly unrealistic. And yet, the Americans didn't wait. The one explanation that holds together to me is this. Hiroshima tested the uranium design. Nagasaki tested the other one, the plutonium design. They needed to compare results. Which, to me, starts to look less like a strategic necessity and more like human experimentation, adjacent morally to Unit 731, a crime against humanity. Before I beg you to like and subscribe and all that jazz, one small anecdote. I've got a very good German friend, a legendary artist actually, born in the 1930s and one of the most intelligent people it has ever been my privilege to know. Properly old school, classic European intellectual. What I am about to tell you was a private conversation, so I refrain from disclosing his identity, because it's already a quite sensitive subject. I've stayed at his home a couple of times, and every evening we'd share a bottle of the local red on the porch and talk. One summer evening, beautiful evening, the conversation turned to nuclear weapons, and what he told me has left a lasting impression on me. He said that, to him, the nuclear weapon represented the coming of age of the human race. Now, what he meant was this. One of the markers of leaving childhood behind is the full, sober awareness that you are capable of ending your own life should you choose to. A child might know the S word, but the concept doesn't really enter a 5-year-old's mind with any weight. So the human race, for better or worse, grew up the day that bomb was built. We are now, whether we like it or not, capable of ending ourselves, as a species, by our own hand. Adulthood means of many things, but one of the things is to take that responsibility seriously. We don't get to be Peter Pan anymore. And above all, we can no longer afford to keep scrapping with the other kids in the playground the way we used to, because we are, unfortunately, no longer innocent children. On that cheerful note, this has been Post Whatever. If you found any of that even remotely useful, or at least mildly diverting. Do consider liking and subscribing. Well, I suspect I've now managed to antagonize absolutely everyone, left and right, east and west, in roughly equal measure. So asking for your support at this point feels a bit rich. But whatever. I'm Ken Nishikawa. Until next time, stay safe.